There was a dessert that didn't crunch. It cracked. A thin sheet of chocolate so delicate that the moment a knife touched it, it gave way with a sound you could hear across the kitchen. Underneath, layers of vanilla ice cream, soft and cold, striped through with more of those same paper-thin chocolate veins. Nothing else in the freezer aisle looked like it. Nothing else sounded like it either. At its peak in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that long, white and gold box sat in the freezer cases of Kroger, Safeway, and Winn-Dixie stores from coast to coast. It wasn't an everyday purchase. Families saved it. They pulled it out on birthdays, on holidays, on the kind of Tuesday night that needed to feel like something more than a Tuesday. Mothers carried it to the table like it was worth carrying carefully, because it was. Children watched the knife go down and waited for that sound. It was the dessert that told everyone at the table, without a single word, that the evening mattered. Then the box stopped appearing on the shelf. No announcement, no farewell. Just an empty space where it used to be. How does a dessert that made an ordinary night feel like a special occasion simply vanish from every freezer case in America? And why did it take 20 years for anyone in a position to bring it back to finally listen? This is that story. The story begins not in America, but in a factory in Gloucester, England, in the early 1980s. Walls, one of Britain's oldest and most trusted ice cream manufacturers, had spent decades making the kinds of frozen desserts that filled British freezers. Solid, reliable, unpretentious. But by 1981, a small team inside the company believed there was something else possible. Something that looked less like a block of frozen dairy and more like something a trained pastry chef might set down on a linen tablecloth. The problem they were trying to solve was deceptively simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to execute. They wanted to make a frozen dessert with visible layers. Real layers, not just swirls or ribbons, but distinct horizontal strata of ice cream and chocolate that a customer could actually see in cross-section when the dessert was sliced. The visual alone would set it apart from everything else in the freezer case. But getting there required engineering that had never been attempted at commercial scale. The core challenge was the chocolate. To create the layered effect, the chocolate had to be applied in sheets thin enough to shatter cleanly when cut, producing that distinctive crack, but structurally sound enough to survive freezing, packaging, shipping, and the temperature fluctuations of a retail freezer case without crumbling into dust. Too thick, and the dessert lost its elegance. Too thin, and it disintegrated before it ever reached a customer's table. The team at Walls, led by Kevin Hillman alongside colleagues Ian Butcher and Gordon Stewart Carrick, spent months working through the problem at the Gloucester facility, testing chocolate viscosities, application temperatures, and layering techniques until they arrived at a process that worked. The method they developed involved spraying liquid chocolate in thin controlled passes over soft serve-style ice cream as it was extruded and shaped. Each pass created a single translucent layer. The ice cream was then built up in waves, that distinctive rippled profile that would become the product's visual signature, with chocolate applied between each pass. The result, when sliced, revealed a cross-section that looked almost architectural. Columns of white ice cream, dark veins of chocolate running through them horizontally, a structure that had no precedent in the commercial frozen dessert market. When the first successful production log came off the line in Gloucester, the decision about what it was and what it should be called came quickly. The name chosen was Viennetta, a word that didn't exist in any dictionary but felt immediately right. It carried the sound of Vienna, of European refinement, of concert halls and pastry cases and things made with care. It sounded, in short, like something worth putting on a dinner table. That was exactly the intention. Walls launched Viennetta in the United Kingdom in 1982, and the positioning was deliberate from the first advertisement. This was not a children's treat. It was not a novelty. It was an affordable luxury. A phrase that sounds like a contradiction but was, in the context of early 1980s Britain, a genuine and underserved market position. The early television advertising showed candlelit dinner tables, elegant serving plates, the unhurried ritual of slicing and serving. The message was clear. You don't need to go to a restaurant to serve something that looks like it came from one. You just need to know where to look in the freezer aisle. The product sold, it sold in a way that surprised even the people who built it. British consumers, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this. Something that felt elevated without being expensive. Something that transformed an ordinary meal into an occasion without requiring any skill to prepare. The only thing required was a sharp knife and the presence of people worth serving it to. By the mid-1980s, Viennetta had become a genuine cultural fixture in British households. Holiday tables, Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations. The box became recognizable. The sound it made when you cut into it became familiar. And within Unilever, the global consumer goods conglomerate that owned Walls, people were beginning to ask a question that, for a product performing this well, was inevitable. What would happen if they took it to America? Viennetta arrived in the United States in 1987, distributed under the Good Humor Breyers banner. Unilever's American ice cream operation, the same company that put Good Humor trucks on summer streets and Breyers cartons in kitchen freezers from New Jersey to Nebraska. The decision to bring Viennetta stateside was not a cautious test. It was a full national push, backed by television advertising and placed directly into the premium section of the frozen dessert case. Not beside the store brand vanilla half gallons, but next to Haagen-Dazs pints and the newly ascendant Dove bar. Viennetta was being introduced to America as what it already was in Britain, something special. The box itself communicated that immediately. Long and narrow, white with gold lettering, it carried a photograph of a sliced log on the front, the layers visible, the chocolate veins crisp against the pale ice cream, the whole thing styled like a magazine food photograph rather than supermarket packaging. In a freezer case full of rectangular cartons and cylindrical tubs, Viennetta's box looked different. It looked considered. Customers who had never heard of it picked it up, turned it over, and read the back not because they were confused, but because they were curious. That curiosity converted. Once a household tried it, they came back. The ritual that developed in American homes was remarkably consistent across the country, and it is worth describing in full because it is where the product's real meaning lived. Viennetta was not eaten casually. It was not scooped from a tub while standing at the kitchen counter. It came out of the freezer and sat on the counter for 5 minutes, sometimes 10, because the chocolate layers needed to soften just enough to yield to a knife without the whole structure fracturing. Then came the knife, a good one usually, the kind pulled from the back of the drawer for occasions that warranted it. The cut produced that sound, a clean, papery crack as the chocolate gave way, followed by the softer resistance of the ice cream beneath. The first slice came away on the blade showing the full cross-section, and it was placed on a plate and carried to the table. That sequence, the waiting, the knife, the sound, the reveal, turned a frozen dessert into something closer to a ceremony. And ceremonies mark time. They tell the people participating in them that this moment is different from the ordinary run of moments. For American families in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Viennetta became one of the ways a weeknight dinner became a special occasion without anyone having to say so out loud. The box in the freezer was enough. Children who spotted it during the grocery run knew before they got home that the evening had been quietly upgraded. The people who grew up with Viennetta in this era remember it with a specificity that is striking even decades later. The memories collected in online communities, the Reddit threads, the Facebook groups with names like Bring Back Viennetta, the comment sections on food nostalgia channels share a consistent emotional register. It isn't simply that the ice cream tasted good, though it did. It is that it appeared at particular moments. Thanksgiving, when a parent wanted something impressive but manageable. Christmas Eve, when the table needed to feel abundant. A Friday night when a working mother had put in a long week and wanted to give her family something that said she had thought of them. Viennetta was the dessert that communicated care without requiring labor. That combination, emotionally generous, practically effortless, is rarer than it sounds and harder to replace than anyone anticipated. The television advertising that accompanied Viennetta's American peak years leaned directly into this positioning. The spots that aired in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s were elegant by the standards of frozen food commercials. Candlelit settings, unhurried editing, the sound of the knife and the crack given their full moment before the voiceover arrived. The message was the same one Walls had developed in Britain, now translated for an American audience that responded to it just as readily. This is the dessert that turns an ordinary dinner into an occasion. The implicit promise was that sophistication was available to everyone. You didn't need to live in a particular zip code or earn a particular income to put something beautiful on the table. You needed a Kroger nearby and $4.99. By the early 1990s, Viennetta was a fixture. It was present in Kroger, Safeway, Winn-Dixie, A&P, and regional independent grocers across all 48 contiguous states. It had moved from novelty to staple in the span of a few years. Not a staple in the sense of something purchased without thought, but a staple in the sense of something counted on. Families knew it would be there. They planned around it. They reached for it when they needed what it provided. The product line expanded modestly during this period. Mint chocolate joined the original vanilla in the early 1990s, offering a variation for the household member who wanted something a little different while keeping the same architecture, the same ritual, the same sound. A chocolate version followed. None of the variants displaced the original. Vanilla remained the one that defined the brand, but their presence confirmed that Viennetta had graduated from experiment to established line. It had earned its space in the freezer case and, more importantly, in the rhythm of American family life. What was it about that moment, the knife, the crack, the first slice carried to the table, that made it feel like more than just dessert? The answer, if there is one, has something to do with what Viennetta asked of the people who served it. It asked them to slow down, to use a good knife, to let the thing rest before cutting, to carry the first slice to someone else before taking one themselves. None of that was written on the packaging. It was just what the product required. And in requiring it, Viennetta turned a routine grocery purchase into something that looked, from across the kitchen, like an act of intention. That was the golden era. And it was real, and it was wide, and it was trusted in the way that only things woven into family routine can be trusted. But in the mid-1990s, the world around Viennetta began to change, and the people making decisions about the brand's future were looking in a different direction entirely. Getting Viennetta onto American shelves was not simply a matter of deciding to sell it there. The product that had been engineered in Gloucester for British freezer cases and British retail logistics was, in several important ways, poorly suited to the American supermarket system as it existed in the late 1980s. Understanding how Good Humor Breyers solved those problems and what compromises were made in solving them is essential to understanding everything that came after. The first challenge was physical. Viennetta's signature log format was long, narrow, and structurally fragile in ways that conventional ice cream packaging was not. A half-gallon carton of Breyers vanilla could be stacked, jostled, partially thawed and refrozen, and delivered across 3 time zones without losing anything essential. Viennetta could not. The chocolate layers that gave the product its character were also its vulnerability. Temperature fluctuations during shipping caused them to contract and expand at different rates than the ice cream surrounding them, producing hairline fractures that, while invisible on the outside of the box, destroyed the visual effect the product depended on when the customer finally cut into it at home. A Viennetta that crumbled rather than cracked was not a premium dessert. It was a disappointment. Good Humor Breyers addressed this through tighter cold chain management than the company had previously applied to any product in its American portfolio. Refrigerated trucks maintained lower temperatures. Distribution routes were redesigned to reduce transit time. Retail partners were given specific instructions about freezer case temperature settings, instructions that not every store manager followed with equal diligence, which would become a source of product quality inconsistency throughout the brand's American run. The infrastructure required to deliver Viennetta intact was more demanding and more expensive than delivering conventional ice cream. And that cost was built into every decision the company made about where and how the product would be sold. The second challenge was placement. Viennetta's premium positioning required premium real estate in the freezer case, eye-level, front-facing, in the section where Haagen-Dazs and Dove bars lived. That space was finite and fiercely contested. Securing it required good-humor buyers to make the case to retail buyers at Kroger, Safeway, Winn-Dixie, and the other major chains that Viennetta would earn its shelf space through sales velocity, rather than simply occupying it. The argument was credible. The product's early performance in test markets had been strong. But it meant that Viennetta entered the American market already in competition, not just with other premium frozen desserts, but with the institutional skepticism of grocery buyers who had seen imported European products underperform before. The national rollout proceeded through 1987 and into 1988, expanding from initial strongholds in the Northeast and Midwest to full national distribution. The speed of that expansion was, by the standards of the era, aggressive. Regional variations in the product were minimal. Unlike some food brands that adjusted formulations by geography, Viennetta was sold with a consistent recipe across markets. This was a deliberate choice, rooted in the brand's identity as something singular and specific. The texture, the flavor, the sound of the cut, these had to be the same in Atlanta as in Boston, or the brand promise collapsed. What the national rollout also required was a production infrastructure in America that could supply the volume the distribution footprint demanded. Viennetta logs could not be economically air freighted from Gloucester at scale. Production for the American market was established domestically, using equipment and processes derived from the Wall's original, but adapted for American manufacturing conditions. The people who worked those production lines understood what they were making and took the quality standards seriously. Former employees who have spoken about the era describe a production environment that was genuinely proud of the product, an awareness that this was not just another frozen dessert coming off a line, but something that required precision. The sales team that represented Viennetta to American retailers during this period occupied an unusual position. They were selling a product that essentially sold itself once a customer tried it, but that required a level of consumer education that most frozen food didn't need. Explaining to a grocery buyer why a dessert that cost nearly $5 and required careful handling would outperform products half its price and twice its shelf life demanded confidence in the brand's proposition. That confidence was, in the late 1980s, well-founded. The product delivered on its promise consistently enough that the retail relationships held, the shelf space was maintained, and the distribution network continued to expand. By the early 1990s, Viennetta was in tens of thousands of retail locations across the United States. It had moved from a European import novelty to a genuine fixture of the American premium frozen dessert category. The colder months drove the strongest sales. Thanksgiving and Christmas were the product's highest volume periods, consistent with its positioning as a special occasion dessert. But Viennetta sold year-round, and its presence in the freezer case had become reliable enough that regular customers stopped noticing how unusual it actually was. That is the deepest form of market penetration, when a product stops being a discovery and becomes an assumption. The machine that had been built to put Viennetta in American freezers was working. The question that nobody was asking loudly enough, in the boardrooms and the buying meetings and the distribution planning sessions of the early 1990s, was whether the machine was built to last, or whether it had been designed for a grocery landscape that was already slowly and imperceptibly beginning to change. By 1992, Viennetta had achieved something that most food brands spend entire marketing budgets chasing and never reach. It had stopped being a product and become a reference point. When American families talked about a nice dessert, not a restaurant dessert, not a made-from-scratch dessert, but the kind of thing that elevated a home dinner without requiring anyone to bake anything. Viennetta was the answer that came to mind first. It occupied a category it had essentially invented, and for a stretch of years in the early 1990s, nothing came close to displacing it from that position. The scale of its presence during this period was significant. Viennetta was available in tens of thousands of retail locations nationwide, carried by every major supermarket chain in the country. Household penetration, the percentage of American homes that purchased the product at least once in a given year, reached levels that placed it among the most recognized brands in the premium frozen dessert segment. The original vanilla remained the dominant variety, but the mint chocolate and chocolate extensions had found their own loyal followings, giving the brand a small but coherent product family rather than a single isolated SKU. In the freezer case, Viennetta occupied its space with the quiet confidence of something that had earned the right to be there. The television advertising that defined Viennetta's peak years was unlike almost anything else appearing in the frozen food category at the time. Where competitors leaned on convenience, quick preparation, easy cleanup, the functional pitch of a product designed for a busy household, Viennetta's commercials made no mention of convenience at all. They were slow, they were quiet. They showed dinner tables set with care. People gathered without urgency. The ritual of slicing performed with deliberateness. The soundtrack was understated. The voiceover, when it appeared, spoke in measured tones about the pleasure of a well-chosen dessert rather than the relief of an easy one. The implicit argument was that Viennetta was worth the 5 minutes it required, that the 5 minutes were, in fact, the point. That argument resonated with a specific and sizable segment of the American consumer population. Working parents, predominantly mothers, who wanted their families to experience something elevated without the labor of producing it themselves. This was not a cynical demographic calculation. It was an accurate description of what the product provided and who needed it most. A woman who had worked a full week, managed a household, and still wanted Friday night dinner to feel like an occasion found in Viennetta, a reliable tool for achieving exactly that effect. The product did the work of presentation so she didn't have to. It arrived at the table looking like effort. It required none. The generational dimension of Viennetta's peak years is worth examining carefully because it shaped the depth of the emotional attachment that would later fuel the brand's remarkable nostalgia economy. The children who grew up in households where Viennetta appeared on special occasions in the late 1980s and early 1990s were, by the mid-1990s, reaching adolescence. They had internalized the product not as a consumer choice, but as a memory structure, a sensory anchor tied to specific evenings, specific people, specific feelings of being gathered together and fed something good. The crack of the chocolate, the cold of the first bite, the way the layers looked on a white plate under kitchen light. These were not advertising impressions. They were lived experiences, and they lodged in memory with the tenacity that only childhood sensory experiences achieve. The people who worked in Viennetta's supply chain during this period described the early 1990s as a genuinely confident era. Sales representatives who carried the product into retail buying meetings recall it as an easy sell, not because the buyers weren't discerning, but because the product's performance in market consistently justified the shelf space it occupied. Production line workers at the American manufacturing facilities understood that what they were producing had a quality standard attached to it that was enforced, not aspirational. There was pride in the work, of the specific kind that comes from making something people genuinely want. When did a frozen dessert become the thing that told your dinner guests, without a single word, that the evening mattered? The answer lived in the cultural moment Viennetta had managed to inhabit. It arrived in America at a time when the idea of the special family dinner was still a living institution, still something that happened regularly enough to require a dessert worthy of it. The late 1980s and early 1990s were the last years before the acceleration of American life made the sit-down family dinner feel like a logistical achievement rather than a default. Viennetta belonged to the era just before that shift. It was designed for a dinner table culture, and it thrived in one. That is precisely what made the years ahead so damaging. The culture that had made Viennetta indispensable was beginning to move. Slowly at first, imperceptibly, the way large things always begin to move, but with a momentum that would prove impossible to reverse. And the people responsible for Viennetta's future in America were, in the mid-1990s, focused on a set of priorities that had very little to do with protecting the culture the brand depended on. The first signs of trouble were easy to miss. Most people missed them entirely. The frozen dessert aisle of an American supermarket in 1995 looked meaningfully different from the same aisle in 1988, and the difference was not subtle if you knew what you were looking for. The individual serving premium ice cream bar had arrived in force. Dove bars, which had been acquired by Mars in 1986 and pushed into national distribution with serious marketing investment, were now a fixture. Haagen-Dazs had expanded its bar and novelty line aggressively. Klondike had moved upmarket. And in 1989, a product called the Magnum Bar, already dominant in Europe under Unilever's own portfolio, was being developed for eventual American introduction. The freezer case was filling with products that shared Viennetta's premium positioning, but required nothing from the consumer except the decision to eat one. No knife, no plate, no waiting, no ceremony. This was the first crack, and it was structural. Viennetta's entire value proposition was built on the ritual it required. The 5 minutes of tempering, the good knife, the sound of the cut, the slice carried to someone else's plate first. These were not inconveniences the brand had failed to engineer away. They were the product's identity. They were what made Viennetta feel like an occasion rather than a snack. But by the mid-1990s, the market was moving decisively toward products that collapsed the distance between impulse and consumption. The individual bar could be eaten alone, standing at the counter, without involving anyone else. It required no occasion. It created none. And it was selling extraordinarily well. The second crack was demographic, and it ran deeper. The sit-down family dinner, the cultural institution that Viennetta had been designed to serve and had thrived within, was in measurable decline by the mid-1990s. The data that would later confirm this trend was not yet widely circulated, but the lived experience of American households was already shifting. Dual-income families were eating dinner later, faster and less formally. Children's after-school schedules were more structured and more demanding. The television that had once been background to a family dinner was increasingly the organizing principle of the evening rather than its accompaniment. The table was still there. The family was still there. But the ritual that Viennetta required, the unhurried production of a dessert that asked everyone to pause and participate, was becoming harder to sustain on a Tuesday night. The third crack was one that Viennetta's management had the least control over and the most responsibility to respond to. Freezer case real estate. The same retail buyers who had welcomed Viennetta into premium freezer space in the late 1980s were, by the mid-1990s, operating under different pressures. The proliferation of premium frozen novelties meant that the competition for eye-level shelf space had intensified significantly. Individual bars and novelty multi-packs had a critical advantage over Viennetta in the metric that retail buyers cared about most: turns per linear foot. A box of 6 Dove bars moved faster than a single Viennetta log. It took up comparable space. It generated comparable or greater revenue per square foot of freezer case. From a pure retail economic standpoint, the argument for giving Viennetta prime placement was weakening, and the argument for giving that space to faster-moving individual items was strengthening with each quarterly review. How long can a product that requires the whole family to sit down together survive in a world that has stopped sitting down together? The people closest to Viennetta on the ground, the regional sales representatives, the grocery category managers, the store-level employees who stocked the freezer cases, began noticing the changes before any of them showed up in national sales data. A store in suburban Ohio that had carried Viennetta at eye level since 1989 moved it to a lower shelf in 1994 to accommodate an expanded Klondike display. A Safeway distribution center in the Pacific Northwest began ordering fewer units per cycle, citing slower turns. A grocery buyer in the Southeast told a Good Humor Breyer's sales rep, with no particular hostility, that Viennetta was a special occasion product in a market that was moving toward everyday treats. He wasn't wrong. He was simply describing, in the flat language of retail economics, the beginning of the end. What made this period particularly difficult, and particularly poignant in retrospect, is that the consumers who loved Viennetta had no idea any of this was happening. They were still buying it when they could find it. They were still pulling it out for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the Friday nights that needed something extra. They were still performing the ritual with the same deliberateness they always had. The shopper in 1995 who reached for Viennetta in the freezer case was not aware that the box she was buying had fewer allies in the corporate structure above it than it had 5 years earlier. She was not aware that the shelf space it occupied was being reconsidered in quarterly planning meetings. She just knew that her family liked it and that she was going to serve it at Easter. The crack, in other words, was invisible from the outside. It was happening in boardrooms and buying meetings and distribution planning sessions, in the language of turns and margins and portfolio priorities. And by the time it became visible, by the time the shelf started going empty, the decisions that had made it inevitable were already years in the past. In 1996, Unilever launched a corporate restructuring initiative that would, over the following several years, reshape the company's entire approach to its brand portfolio. The strategic logic was straightforward and, from a pure business perspective, defensible. Unilever owned more than 1,600 brands worldwide, and the resources required to maintain, market, and grow that many individual products were diluting the company's ability to invest meaningfully in any of them. The solution was consolidation. Identify the brands with the strongest global potential. Concentrate investment behind them. Allow the others to decline gracefully, or not so gracefully, as the portfolio contracted toward a more manageable core. Viennetta was not on the short list. This was not a decision made in anger or in ignorance. The people inside Unilever who evaluated the brand understood what it was and what it had meant to American consumers. The sales history was real. The customer loyalty was documented. The nostalgia equity, the depth of emotional attachment that had built up over a decade of family dinner tables and holiday occasions, was not invisible to the analysts who reviewed the brand's position, but nostalgia equity does not appear as a line item in a quarterly planning document. And by the mid-1990s, the metrics that did appear on those documents were telling a story of a brand in gradual retreat. Shelf space was declining. Distribution points were contracting. The year-over-year sales trajectory was negative and had been for long enough to constitute a trend rather than an anomaly. The brand that Unilever chose to invest in instead, the brand that received the marketing resources, the product development attention, and the strategic priority that Viennetta did not, was Magnum. The Magnum bar had been a European phenomenon since its introduction in 1989, and Unilever had been building toward an American launch for years. Magnum was individual serving, handheld, premium priced, and perfectly aligned with the direction the frozen dessert market was moving. It required no ceremony. It required no occasion. It could be eaten alone without implication. Unilever's confidence in Magnum as a global brand was not misplaced. The product would eventually become one of the best-selling ice cream bars in the world. But the resources that went to Magnum's development and eventual American positioning were resources that did not go to Viennetta. In a portfolio of finite investment capacity, every dollar is a choice, and the choice had been made. What the consolidation strategy meant in practice for Viennetta in the American market was a form of institutional neglect that is more damaging than active discontinuation because it is slower and less visible. The brand received no significant new marketing investment after the early 1990s. There were no new television campaigns. There were no product line extensions designed to address the shift toward individual serving formats. There was no strategic response to the freezer case real estate pressure. No smaller format, no multi-pack novelty version, no product innovation that might have allowed Viennetta to compete on the terms the market was increasingly demanding. The brand was left to trade on the equity it had built without the investment required to maintain that equity against competitors who were spending aggressively. The formula itself remained consistent. This is worth stating clearly because Viennetta's decline was not driven by a recipe change that alienated loyal customers, which is the more common villain in stories of this kind. The product that sat in American freezer cases in 1998 tasted the same as the product that had sat there in 1990. The chocolate layers were the same. The vanilla ice cream was the same. The sound of the cut was the same. What had changed was everything around it: the shelf position, the marketing support, the corporate priority, and the cultural context in which the product was being asked to sell itself. Viennetta was the same. America was different, and nobody in a position of authority over the brand was doing anything meaningful to bridge that gap. The regional sales representatives who carried Viennetta in their portfolios through the late 1990s describe a period of mounting frustration. They were selling a product that consumers who knew it still wanted, into a retail environment that was increasingly reluctant to give it space, with marketing support that had effectively ceased. The tools available to them, price promotions, display allowances, the persuasive power of a strong national campaign, had been removed one by one as the brand's budget contracted. What remained was the product itself and the personal relationships the reps had built with store-level buyers over years of consistent service. For a while, those relationships held. They held longer than the economics strictly warranted. But relationships between a sales rep and a grocery buyer are not permanent structures. They are maintained by the mutual belief that the product being sold is going somewhere. When that belief erodes, the relationships erode with it. The grocery buyers who made the shelf space decisions during this period were not villains. They were professionals operating within rational systems, responding to data that was clear and consistent, a product that turned slowly, that required special handling, that was receiving no national marketing support, and that was positioned for an occasion-based consumption pattern in a market moving toward everyday convenience, was, by every metric available to a retail buyer in 1997 or 1998, a candidate for reduced placement. The buyers reduced it. They were following the logic of their profession. Nobody told them that the product they were moving to the bottom shelf had been the centerpiece of 10 million family dinners. That information was not in the system. Who exactly bears responsibility when a brand isn't killed by one bad decision, but by 1,000 decisions to do nothing? The answer is uncomfortable precisely because it is distributed. No single executive made the call to end Viennetta in America. No board meeting produced a resolution discontinuing the product. What happened instead was an accumulation of smaller decisions: budget allocations that excluded the brand, shelf space negotiations that went uncontested, product development roadmaps that left no room for a Viennetta innovation, each of which was individually defensible and collectively fatal. The brand was not pushed off a cliff. It was walked slowly and without ceremony to the edge of a very long slope, and then the people responsible for it turned around and walked back to their offices to work on something with better margins. By the late 1990s, Viennetta's presence in American supermarkets had contracted to a shadow of its early 1990s peak. It was still technically available in some markets. It still appeared occasionally in the freezer case of a Kroger or a Safeway that hadn't yet rationalized its premium dessert section. But the box that appeared there was increasingly an afterthought, undersupported, undersized in its shelf allocation, and entirely without the marketing presence that had once made it feel like the obvious choice for a special occasion. The product was still there. The brand was already gone. And then, for most American households, the box stopped appearing at all. There was no announcement. That is the first thing to understand about how Viennetta disappeared from American supermarkets, because the absence of an announcement is itself a fact worth sitting with. Major food companies issue press releases when they launch products. They issue them when they reformulate products. They issue them, sometimes, when they discontinue products that have enough public profile to warrant a managed exit. Unilever and Good Humor Breyers issued nothing about Viennetta. There was no final production run communicated to consumers. No farewell edition packaging. No statement thanking loyal customers for decades of support. The product simply became harder to find, then harder still, and then, in most American markets, by approximately 2000 and 2001, it was gone. The shelf where it had lived was filled with something else. The space closed over it the way water closes over a stone. The experience of losing Viennetta was therefore experienced differently by different households, depending on when their particular store stopped receiving shipments. For some families, the disappearance happened during the holiday season, the worst possible timing for a product that had been a Thanksgiving and Christmas staple for 15 years. A woman who had served Viennetta at every Christmas Eve dinner since 1989 walked into her Kroger in November of 1999 and found the space empty. She asked a stock clerk. The clerk didn't know. She asked the department manager. He told her they hadn't received a shipment in several weeks and didn't have a reorder date. She drove to a second store, then a third. The product wasn't there either. She went home and served something else, and the Christmas Eve table was, in a way she couldn't fully articulate at the time, slightly diminished. That experience, The search across multiple stores, the unanswered questions from store employees, the quiet substitution of something adequate for something loved was replicated in households across the country throughout 1999, 2000, and 2001. The disappearance was not simultaneous. Different regional distribution networks wound down at different rates, which meant that Viennetta lingered in some markets after it had vanished from others. A shopper in Atlanta might find it in January of 2000, while a shopper in Seattle had last seen it 6 months earlier. This staggered erasure had an unintended cruelty to it. It prevented the kind of collective public mourning that a clean, announced discontinuation might have produced. Instead of a shared goodbye, there were millions of individual small losses, each experienced in the context of a specific freezer case in a specific store on a specific evening, with no one on the other side of the transaction prepared to explain what had happened or why. The internet in 2000 and 2001 was not yet the infrastructure of collective consumer grief that it would later become. Social media did not exist. The mechanisms that would eventually allow millions of people who shared a specific food memory to find each other and articulate their loss together were still years away. But the early signs of what that grief would become were already appearing in the discussion forums and early food community websites of the era. Posts asking whether anyone else remembered Viennetta began appearing on general nostalgia boards and food discussion groups in the early 2000s. And the responses they generated were immediate and emotionally specific in a way that distinguished them from ordinary product nostalgia. People weren't just saying they missed the taste. They were describing the occasions. The Christmas table, the birthday dinner, the Friday night that had felt special because of the box in the freezer. The loss being described was not simply the loss of a flavor. It was the loss of a tool for making ordinary life feel significant. As the decade progressed and online communities became more sophisticated, the Viennetta nostalgia infrastructure grew with them. Facebook groups dedicated to bringing the product back accumulated tens of thousands of members. Numbers that, in the context of a discontinued frozen dessert, represented an unusual depth of sustained emotional investment. The groups were not passive. Members posted childhood photographs in which a Viennetta box was visible on a holiday table. They shared scanned newspaper grocery advertisements from the 1980s and 1990s that listed the product and its price. They described, in careful detail, the specific sensory experience of the cut, the sound, the visual of the layers, the temperature of the first bite, with the precision of people trying to preserve a memory they were afraid of losing. Reddit threads on the subject ran to hundreds of comments, each one a small personal history organized around a frozen dessert. The secondary market told its own story. New old stock, sealed Viennetta boxes that had been purchased before discontinuation and stored in home freezers, or that surfaced occasionally from restaurant supply overstock, appeared on eBay during the early 2000s and commanded prices that made no rational economic sense relative to what the product had sold for at retail. People were not buying these boxes to eat the contents, in most cases. They were buying them to have the object, to hold the box, to confirm with physical evidence that the memory was real and the product had existed. That impulse, to verify a memory through an artifact, speaks to something that goes beyond ordinary consumer preference. It speaks to the role the product had played in people's sense of their own past. What Viennetta's American disappearance also revealed, with some bitterness, was the geographic arbitrariness of the loss. The product had not ceased to exist. In the United Kingdom, Viennetta continued to be sold without interruption, a fixture of British supermarkets throughout the entire period of its American absence. In Australia, in parts of Asia, in several European markets, the long white and gold box was still available, still being sliced at dinner tables, still producing that sound. American consumers who discovered this fact, usually through a British relative or a food nostalgia article that mentioned the product's continued existence elsewhere, experienced a specific variety of frustration that combined abandonment with the knowledge that the abandonment was a choice. The product existed. The company that owned it had simply decided that the American market was no longer worth serving. The factory workers and production line employees who had made Viennetta for the American market experienced the wind down as a gradual reduction rather than a sudden closure. Production schedules were cut back before they were eliminated. Shifts were reduced before facilities were repurposed. The people who had taken pride in the precision the product required, the careful application of chocolate layers, the quality control checks that ensured every log met the standard, found themselves making less of it, then much less, then none. There were no dramatic layoffs tied specifically to Viennetta's discontinuation because the contraction happened slowly enough to be absorbed into the normal attrition of a large manufacturing operation. But the knowledge that something particular had ended, something that had required skill and care, and had produced genuine pleasure in the people who received it, was present among the people who had made it. By 2001, Viennetta was, for practical purposes, absent from the American market. The shelf space it had occupied had been filled. The retail buyers who had carried it had moved on to other priorities. The marketing team that might have fought for its survival had been redirected toward brands with better forward momentum. And the millions of Americans who had grown up with it were left with a memory that had no current object to attach itself to, a sensory experience without a product, a ritual without the thing the ritual required. The product was gone. The memory, as it turned out, was not. The shelf space that Viennetta had occupied in American freezer cases did not stay empty for long. It never does. The economics of retail ensure that vacant premium real estate is filled within a single inventory cycle, and the products that moved into the space Viennetta left behind were, in most cases, exactly the kind of products whose rise had contributed to its decline. Individual serving premium bars, multi-pack novelty items, products designed for solo consumption, for convenience, for the freezer door grab, rather than the dinner table presentation. The replacement products were good. Some of them were excellent. None of them were the same thing. None of them asked anything of the person eating them. None of them made a sound when you cut into them. The freezer case moved on with the efficient indifference that markets always display toward what they have displaced, and the space where Viennetta had lived became, within a season, unrecognizable as the place it had been. For the consumers who had loved Viennetta, there was no adequate substitute on offer. This is not nostalgia speaking. It is a structural observation about what the product had provided and what the market that replaced it was offering. Viennetta had occupied a specific and unusual position, a frozen dessert designed for shared consumption, for the dinner table rather than the couch, for an occasion rather than an impulse. The products that filled its space were solving different problems for different consumption contexts. Ice cream cakes from Dairy Queen and Carvel addressed the special occasion need, but they required advance ordering, advance planning, and a trip to a specialty counter rather than a spontaneous decision at the supermarket freezer case. Haagen-Dazs and Magnum bars, when Magnum finally launched in the United States in 2011, addressed the premium indulgence need, but individually, privately, without ceremony. The gap that Viennetta left was real, and the market, despite its efficiency in filling shelf space, did not fill it. The online communities that had formed around Viennetta's memory during the 2000s grew steadily through the 2010s, and their character evolved in a way that distinguished them from ordinary product nostalgia groups. Most discontinued food products attract a period of mourning that gradually diminishes as the memory fades and the generation that held it ages. Viennetta's online communities did not diminish. They grew. The Facebook groups gained members continuously throughout the decade. The Reddit threads were revisited and revived by new participants who had heard about the product from older siblings or parents and wanted to understand what the attachment was about. The emotional intensity of the conversation remained high in a way that suggested the nostalgia was not fading. It was being transmitted. Unilever received the signal. Consumer feedback operations at major food companies track social media sentiment and community activity around their brand portfolios. And by the mid-2010s, the volume and consistency of the conversation around Viennetta's American absence was impossible to overlook. Change.org petitions calling for the product's return accumulated tens of thousands of signatures. Food media publications ran occasional pieces on discontinued American favorites in which Viennetta appeared with reliable frequency. The cumulative weight of this sustained consumer expression was building a business case for re-entry, not yet sufficient to trigger action, but sufficient to keep the conversation alive inside Unilever's American brand planning teams. The decision to bring Viennetta back to the United States was announced in early 2021, with the product returning to retail shelves under the Good Humor brand that spring. The timing was not accidental. The COVID-19 pandemic had fundamentally altered the rhythms of American domestic life in ways that, from a product positioning standpoint, aligned almost perfectly with what Viennetta had always offered. Americans were home. They were cooking more, eating together more, looking for ways to make the evenings feel like something other than an extension of the anxiety of the preceding months. The special occasion frozen dessert, the thing you pulled out of the freezer to tell your family that tonight was different, had not felt this relevant since the early 1990s. Unilever read the moment correctly and moved. The return generated a response that surprised even the people who had been tracking the brand's nostalgia equity for years. Social media coverage was immediate and extensive. Food publications ran pieces not just noting the return, but exploring the cultural history of the product and the depth of the attachment Americans had maintained toward it across 2 decades of absence. People who had not thought about Viennetta in years found themselves in supermarket freezer aisles photographing the box and sending the image to siblings and childhood friends with messages that needed no explanation beyond the photograph itself. The product had been gone for 20 years, and its return felt, to a significant portion of the American consumer population, like the resolution of something unfinished. The returned product was not identical to its predecessor in every respect. 20 years of supply chain evolution, ingredient sourcing changes, and manufacturing process updates meant that claiming perfect equivalence would be inaccurate. Whether the differences were perceptible to consumers was a question the online communities debated with characteristic thoroughness, with opinions divided between those who found the 2021 version faithful to memory and those who detected subtle variations in the chocolate layers or the texture of the ice cream. What was not debated was the emotional significance of the return. The box was back. The ritual was available again. The sound could be made once more in American kitchens, over American dinner tables, in front of American families who had been waiting, some of them for 20 years, to hear it. What does it mean that it took a pandemic and 20 years of absence for a company to remember what its customers never forgot? The lesson that Viennetta's American story offers to the food industry is one that the industry has been slow to absorb because it runs counter to the financial logic that governs brand portfolio management. Nostalgia equity, the accumulated emotional investment that consumers make in a product over years of meaningful use, is a real asset. It does not depreciate at the rate that sales figures suggest when a brand is being neglected. It can survive, largely intact, for decades of product absence, sustained by the communities that form around shared memory and the generational transmission of specific sensory experiences. A brand that is allowed to go dark is not necessarily a brand that has died. It may simply be a brand that is waiting in the freezer cases of other countries and in the memories of its former customers for someone to decide it is worth bringing back. The cost of ignoring that equity in consumer trust, in the years of sales foregone, in the emotional tax imposed on the people who loved the product and were given no explanation for its disappearance, is a cost that does not appear on the balance sheet where the decision was made. It appears in the Facebook groups, in the Reddit threads, in the woman who drove to 3 different stores on a November evening in 1999 looking for a box that was no longer coming. There is a specific quality to the cold of a frozen dessert that has been allowed to rest on a counter for exactly the right amount of time. Not the aggressive cold of something pulled directly from the freezer, that cold that numbs before it flavors. The other kind, the cold that has softened just enough to carry the flavor forward, to let the vanilla breathe, to allow the chocolate to yield without resistance. That was the cold Viennetta arrived at after 5 minutes on a kitchen counter, and it was a cold that required patience to achieve and delivered something in return for the patience. The knife went down. The sound came. that clean, papery crack that traveled through the kitchen and announced to everyone within earshot that something worth gathering for was about to be served. The first slice came away showing its interior, white and dark, layered and precise, looking more like something constructed than something frozen. It was placed on a plate, it was carried to the table. And the evening, whatever kind of evening it had been before that moment, became something slightly different, slightly more considered, slightly more intentional from that point forward. That is what it was. That is the whole of it, described as accurately as memory and language allow. The taste was cold vanilla and thin dark chocolate, together and in alternation, and it was very good. But the taste was not the thing. The thing was what the taste arrived inside of. The ritual, the sound, the visual of the layers, the act of serving someone else before yourself. Viennetta required all of that, and all of that required other people. It was a dessert that could not be fully experienced alone, not because of any technical limitation, but because its meaning was constituted by the presence of others. You needed someone to carry the first slice to. You needed a table to carry it to. You needed an evening worth the effort of pulling out a good knife. Without those things, Viennetta was just ice cream. With them, it was something else. A small, cold, temporary monument to the idea that the people around you were worth a moment of ceremony. What Viennetta provided to the American households that made it a fixture of their special occasions was something that the food industry has never found a clean way to quantify or replicate. It was not luxury in the aspirational sense. It made no claim to exclusivity, asked no premium that put it beyond ordinary reach. It was not convenience, which is what the industry spent the following decades perfecting and selling. It was something in between and something beyond both. The feeling that an ordinary evening had been recognized as worth honoring. The working mother who placed the box in her grocery cart on a Friday afternoon was not buying a dessert. She was buying the capacity to tell her family, through the medium of a long white and gold box, that the week was over and they had made it through and tonight was going to be good. That message was delivered wordlessly through a crack of chocolate and a slice on a plate, and it was received clearly by every person at the table who understood, without being told, what the presence of that box meant. The children who received that message grew up. They carried the memory of what it meant into their own adult lives, their own households, their own dinner tables. They described the taste to people who had never tried it with an attention to sensory detail that was unusual for a mass-market frozen dessert. The specific temperature, the specific sound, the specific visual of the layers. Because the memory was specific in the way that only formative experiences are specific. It had been laid down in childhood, in the context of being gathered and cared for, and it had stayed. 20 years of the product's absence had not eroded it. The memory was intact because the experience it preserved had been intact, real, specific, and tied to something that mattered. The people who made Viennetta deserve to be remembered in this accounting. Kevin Hillman and his colleagues Ian Butcher and Gordon Stewart Carrick, working in a factory in Gloucester in the early 1980s, were trying to solve a technical problem. How to make a frozen dessert with visible layers. They solved it with precision and ingenuity, and in solving it, they created something that traveled across an ocean and became part of the texture of millions of American lives. They could not have known that. They were engineers and food scientists working on a production challenge. But the object they produced had a life far beyond the factory where it was made, and that life was built on the quality of the work they did in getting it right. The production line workers who made Viennetta for American consumers through the late 1980s and 1990s brought to their work a standard of precision that the product required and that the people who ultimately received it, without knowing where it came from or who had made it, depended on entirely. The sales representatives who put it in front of retail buyers, who defended its shelf space, who drove it in refrigerated trucks to stores across the country, were part of a chain of care that connected a factory floor in one country to a dinner table in another. Every person in that chain was doing something that mattered, in the service of something that mattered, even if the quarterly reports that governed the decisions above them never found a column for that kind of mattering. And the families. The parents who bought it, the children who watched the knife go down, the grandmothers who served it at Easter, the fathers who carried it to the table on the Friday nights that needed to be more than Friday nights. They were not passive consumers of a product. They were participants in a ritual that the product made possible, and they performed that ritual with a seriousness and a consistency that the brand, in its neglect of them, did not deserve but received anyway, freely for as long as the box was available to receive it. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing to their child the sound a thin chocolate layer makes when a knife passes through it for the first time. The child has never heard it, but from the way it is described, carefully, precisely, with something close to reverence, they understand that a real and specific and unrepeatable thing was once here, that it lived in the freezer cases of 10,000 American supermarkets, that it traveled to dinner tables on ordinary evenings and made them extraordinary, that it asked only for a good knife and 5 minutes of patience and gave back something that 2 decades of absence could not dissolve. They understand that it mattered, and they understand, from the way the description ends, quietly, without resolution, in the particular silence of someone recalling something they cannot return to, that its being gone still matters too.